Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. This lecture is an introduction to what we call Middle English literature from around 1200 to 1485. It's really the peak of medieval literature in the English context, especially with the 14th century. So, very exciting. Let's get started. The historical context of this work that we need to keep in mind is the 14th century is a tumultuous time. And there's just a few things that we can only just scratch the surface on, but we have the beginnings of the Hundred Years' War in 1336, 1337. Edward III is uh, beginning this war to enforce his claims on the throne of France, and these wars would go on intermittently for 100 years, as per the name of the wars. We have a papal schism. So this leads to further questioning the legitimacy of ecclesiastical offices and revealing, let's say, the worldly greed driving of some religious practices. We do have the flourishing in Middle English literature in the latter half of the century, particularly with works such as those by the Pearl poet, sometimes called the Gawain poet, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Geoffrey Chaucer, William Langland, Piers Plowman, and Chaucer in particular with his knowledge of the Latin classics, so Virgil and Ovid, and of the Italian masters, Dante, Boccaccio, Petrarch, really starts to enlarge the literary horizons of English poetry. And for that reason, Chaucer, well, among others, Chaucer is known as the father of English poetry. So let's take a quick look at Sir Gawain and the Green Knight as an important work to have in mind if we're thinking about Middle English literature. As I said, it's known as the Gawain poet or the Pearl poet. Rough date of composition would be the latter quarter of the 14th century and part of an alliterative revival. So remember, Old English is highly alliterative. With the Anglo-Norman conquest, we get these French literary styles and subject matter that displace some of the themes as well as the poetic style of composition of the Old English, including displacing alliterative. Here in the latter part of the 14th century, a bit of an alliterative revival. Overview of what takes place in this poem. So during the New Year's Eve feast at King Arthur's court, a Green Knight interrupts the festivities and challenges a knight to a beheading game. Sir Gawain accepts the challenge, beheads the Green Knight, who miraculously survives, and reminds Gawain he must receive a return blow in 1 year. So Gawain journeys to find the Green Chapel and stays at Lord Bertilac's castle, where he agrees to an exchange of winnings game with his host. Lady Bertilac attempts to seduce Gawain for 3 days, testing his chastity and courtesy while the Lord is hunting. Gawain accepts a green girdle that she claims will protect him from harm, but fails to exchange it with his host as per their agreement. At the Green Chapel, the Green Knight reveals he is Bertilac and that the whole test was orchestrated by Morgan Le Fay. Gawain is mildly nicked on the neck for his one lapse of honesty in concealing the girdle. So some themes there. Nature of chivalry and honor are really in display there with the hero Gawain being tested in this. And like all mortals, he's an ideal type, but like all mortals, he's flawed, doesn't get out perfectly, but does let's say demonstrate that code. The temptation and testing, Gawain's trials, the beheading game, the seduction attempts, and the exchange of winnings prove his moral and physical courage. Also, there's conflict between the natural world and courtly society, the wild, magical nature of the Green Knight in the wilderness contrast with the civilized, human-made world of Camelot and Bertilac's castle. So another important work to have in back of our minds as we're thinking about Middle English literature, maybe we're studying Chaucer in particular, is Piers Plowman by William Langland. And the poem exists in three major revised versions known as the A, B, and C texts, showing decades of work that William Langland put on this. And the poem is structured as a series of allegorical dream visions, highly allegorical work. So a very good example of of this allegorical mode of literary obscurity, for instance, that we were talking about in medieval literary theory. And I'll put a link to that lecture. There's a series of 2 lectures on medieval literary theory. I'll put a link in the description. In the first dream, Will sees a fair field full of folk, so representing society and the conflict between Lady Mead, so reward, bribery, and conscience. So highly allegorical, right? The humble, honest peasant Piers the Plowman appears and agrees to lead the penitent 7 deadly sins on a pilgrimage to truth, God potentially. The central quest shifts from the pilgrimage to a quest for the states of Christian living, embodied in the concepts of do well, do better, and do best. And Piers evolves from a simple farmer to a figure representing the ideal Christian and eventually a Christ-like embodiment of charity who builds the church, unity, and poem ends with the forces of the Antichrist and the friars attacking unity, leaving Will to continue his spiritual search. So some themes, the quest for truth and salvation as part of a Christian life, central driving force of Will and humanity's search for the proper way to live a true Christian life, social and religious satire and critique. So the poem exposes widespread corruption and hypocrisy across all 3 estates of medieval society. So the clergy, nobility, and the commons, and the dignity of labor and the common man. Piers the Plowman is a simple worker, is held up as the ideal of Christian virtue, challenging the corrupt social hierarchy. This is interesting because this is not always the case, right? Especially in the classical world. The world of the laborer is something to live the good life, you need to be able to be a free person, not encumbered to labor. Labor is for those who are naturally born slaves in Aristotle's politics. You, if you are an aristocrat, you have been born to have the freedom to pursue whether it's civic virtue or even better yet, the theoretical virtue of pursuing wisdom as a philosopher. Labor is demeaning. There's no such thing as the dignity, pardon me, of work in the classical world. We begin to see at this time perhaps a redemption of this concept of labor as being something honest and virtuous. We'll see it as well, for instance, in More's Utopia, which is written a little over 100 years later. Love and charity, the poem ultimately emphasizes that love is the greatest path to salvation, transcending both knowledge and wealth. I want to go back to historical context and highlight the fact that another, let's say, troubling event, to say the least, was this Black Death or plague that swept across Europe, wiping out 30 to 60% of the population. Absolutely horrific. So I found this an interesting period to study when COVID-19 first broke out. And, many people thought that this was the end of the world and, that this was so horrible that we need to shut down our economies and get into our houses. Different sense of risk perception, obviously, now than at that time where such a large percentage of the population could be wiped out in that type of plague. And of course, rebounds of that plague echoed on. And there's the plague in London in 1660s that is an echoing of this plague. So one work that draws a haunting picture of the effects of this plague is the author's introduction to Boccaccio's Decameron, which is frame narrative that probably served as an inspiration for Chaucer's frame narrative in the Canterbury Tales. So the Decameron is a set of 10 days. They said they tell each other 10 tales. So adding up to 100 tales, obviously. And the prompting event for them to have this tale telling is that they've had to flee the city because of this plague. And the author's introduction depicts haunting portrayals of that. Historically speaking, the plague brings images of mortality and death become normalized, and the figure of death becomes more important in literature and iconography in this period. Raises questions of how one should live, morality. There's the differential effect on rich and poor is highlighted. Also, historically, a social mobility of labor. The plague, for many economic historians, is credited with uh, creating a great deal of social mobility, as the shortage of labor after large swaths of the population had been killed by this disease allowed for those survivors to take on wealth, to take on the jobs that had been vacated. So 1381, this peasants' revolt breaks out, widespread popular uprising of tenant farmers, rebels burn down the palace of John of Gaunt. An example of the type of, let's say, echoing after the plague, the this tenant farmers beginning to assert themselves to a greater extent. So I want to turn now to this great work of philosophy, literature. Boethius is the Consolation of Philosophy. So very important throughout the Middle Ages, but especially in the 14th century in a time of turmoil, as we've already seen. So Boethius is living, 900 years before the period we're talking about. He's living in the tail end of the classical Roman world. He's born into a life of privilege, adopted after the death of his parents by an even more prominent family, attains the highest office under Theodoric, Emperor of the Western Roman Empire, and is also devoted to a life of study. He planned to translate and provide commentary on the complete works of Plato and Aristotle. He completed a translation and commentary of Aristotle's logical works, and thanks to him, they were preserved in the West. He invented the term quadrivium, the four-way path for the study of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, to be studied after the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. He was then accused of treason, of colluding with those supporting the Eastern Emperor Justin in the overthrow of Theodoric in 523. So he writes the Consolation of Philosophy while imprisoned in Pavia. And as I said, this is probably the most influential single text in the Middle Ages after the Bible. And he was executed after a year in Pavia. The structure of this work is first a discussion of the ultimate nature of the good in the first three books. And there's including a lament of Boethius on his fate. He then encounters an allegorical figure, Lady Philosophy, on the nature of fortune as changeable and you can't put your faith in it. And book three, the claim that the ultimate good is being directed toward God, not material things. Secondly, in book four, there's this discussion of the nature of evil. Why is there evil in the world? Ultimately, it's part of the divine plan and providence. Then a discussion of divine providence and free will. And claim is made that divine providence does not preclude free will. So, Lady Philosophy, why not use, I guess it could be a question, why not use a personification of Christ if the ultimate message is about, let's say, the truths of Christianity? For Boethius, and within the medieval synthesis of Athens and Jerusalem, classical reason is not incompatible with faith. So Lady Philosophy can lead us to this truth. I'll just also underscore this notion that the whole work is allegorical. This personification or figure stands in for this abstract concept and follows in that deep traditions of allegorical interpretation in the Middle Ages. And again, in the description, I'll have a link to the medieval literary theory lectures. An important discussion early on is this notion of the wheel of fortune, and becomes an important emblem throughout medieval literature and iconography. And the the wheel of fortune is about this realm of the physical world that we can't control. And fortune, the ups and downs that we experience in our lives, is is something that we shouldn't put our faith in. We shouldn't put our identity in, like whether or not you're doing well in terms of wealth, whether or not you're doing well in terms of fame. These things are not within your control. and they're not as important as being directed towards the divine. So it turns out that this realm of fortune, of ups and downs, is basically our own limited perspective on God's plan. That's what we find out in terms of why is there evil? Why do we have misfortunes? Well, there's a plan there, you just don't see it. So our limited vision of these things manifests itself as fortune. So here's a quote from book 2. I know the manifold deceits of that monstrous lady Fortune, in particular her fawning friendship with those whom she intends to cheat, until the moment when she unexpectedly abandons them and leaves them reeling in agony beyond endurance. Having entrusted yourself to Fortune's dominion, you must conform to her your mistress's ways. What are you trying to halt the motion of her whirling wheel? Dimmest of fools that you are, you must realize that if the wheel stops turning, it ceases to be the course of chance. So there's a certain dualism there. The goods of this world are fickle and they're ruled by fortune, and the ultimate good for humans is the divine. And there's this distinction between time and eternity. The goods of this world are temporal, fleeting, fickle, wealth, fame. They will come and go. And the ultimate good is timeless, virtue, true happiness. So there are elements of Stoicism here. So Stoicism, one example of a figure who utters these principles, Epictetus, from the 1st century of the Common Era, distinguishes between what is in our power and what is not. Happiness is achieved by properly accepting that which is beyond one's control to change, physical world, fame, fortune, and changing those things one does control, i.e., our ideas about the world. So, and this is important. So we don't control our house, we don't control our even our own bodies. Our bodies will be injured, will decay, will age over time. These are things we can't control. We can only control our attitude to all of these things. So Epictetus in his handbook begins this way. Some things are up to us and some things are not up to us. Our opinions are up to us and our impulses, desires, aversions. In short, whatever it is our own doing. Our bodies are not up to us, nor are our possessions, our reputations, or our public offices, or that is, whatever is not our own doing. So, Lady Philosophy's guidance to Boethius in this work seems akin to Stoicism in a few key ways, i.e., nothing is miserable unless you think it is so. And on the other hand, nothing brings happiness unless you are content with it. So I want to end with a discussion of Chaucer's Truth. So this is an important short poem of Chaucer's. We'll have another video where we do more of an in-depth dive into Chaucer as well as the general prologue to his Canterbury Tales. But for now, I want to look at this work as a good example of the kind of an overview of the medieval worldview with respect to this consolation of philosophy. So you see Geoffrey Chaucer's dates there, and his poem encapsulates poetically and articulates quite clearly many of the central tenets of the medieval worldview described above. So be satisfied with what is given in life. Do not put stock in great wealth or power. Like all the gifts of fortune, they are fleeting and fickle. Take a stoic attitude to the faults in this world. Our lives have a predetermined purpose, and our life is a journey or a pilgrimage to our spiritual home. This world is not our home. Now, this notion of life as a pilgrimage, of course, is given a literary kind of bringing forth and manifestation in the Canterbury Tales, the whole frame narrative of the journey. So this is the short poem, Truth. Flay fro the place, and dwell with soothfastness. Sufficient to thee thing, though it be small, for hoard hath heart, and gleaming fickleness. Grace hath envy, and well blent over all. Savor no more than thee behoove shall. Rule well thyself, other folk and trade, and truth thee shall deliver. It is no dread. So flay fro the place. So So flee from the crowd, get away from the crowd and trying to be influenced by what they value. Because again, these are things that you can't control and they're not going to bring you happiness. And dwell with soothfastness, truth. Suffice, so be sufficed into with your own thing, into thy thing, though it be small. For hoard hath hat. So obviously alliteration there. Um, so hoarding, storing, greed has hateful origins, and climbing, trying to strive for social the social ladder or the political ladder is unstable. Crowd is envious, place hath envy, and wealth lent. So and wealth blinds overall. Savor or desire or savor no more than what is proper to you, what you should have, and rule yourself. And that is what others can, can advise. And truth will deliver you. So this is obviously a New, New Testament credo. It is, there's no dread or fear. There's no fear or doubt about that. That is the thing that you can be sure of. Tempest thee not all crooked to redress it. And trust of hill that turneth as a ball. So that's the Lady Fortune who turns the wheel of fortune. Great rest stand in little busyness. Beware therefore to spurn against an all. So don't try to kick against an all. You're not going to get very far if you do that. Strive not as doth the crook with the wad. Daunt thyself that dauntest others dead, and truth thee shall deliver. It is no dread. That thee is sent, receive in buxomness. You are sent, you are on a mission. You are, there is a divine providence for your life and for all of existence. Receive that in obedience. Be obedient to the will of God. The wrestling for this world axeth a fall. Here is none home, here nis but wilderness. This is not your home. This is just a wilderness you're passing through. Forth, pilgrim, forth, forth, beast, out of the stall. So go forth, pilgrim. You're a pilgrim in this world. Go forth, beast, out of your stall. So your existence here is almost animal-like, right? Know the country, look up, thank God of all. Hold the highway and let the ghost be laid. So follow the upward way and let your spirit lead you, and truth they shall deliver. It is no dread. And there's an envoy, it's a poetic sending at the end of this. Therefore, thou Vash, leave thine wretchedness. So there seems to be addressed to Sir Philip de la Vache, but he's making a play on this as cow, fourth pilgrim, fourth beast out of thy stall. Unto the world leave now to be thrall. Free him mercy, that of his high goodness made thee of naught, and in the special draw unto him and pray in general, for thee and eke of other, heavenly made, and truth thee shall deliver. It is no dread. So I find this to be a great little poem for as an entryway to Middle English literature, medieval literature in general. Also a great entryway to Chaucer. And with that, I'll close. The next lectures for this course will be a discussion of Chaucer. We'll do an introduction to Chaucer as well as looking into the general prologue of Canterbury Tales. Thank you very much.